So Nathan, I'm really glad you could make some time at short notice, super short notice. Sorry about that, but
That's
I was reading an article in The Economist over the weekend, and I thought it was something we should maybe write about in our weekly newsletter, because it's talking about things which I think is probably starting to reach the awareness of a lot of advisors who are getting demand for ESG from clients, and sometimes people think there's a one size fit all approach for this. Like this Economist article is unpicking, the SEC in the US, they're starting to focus on this concept of greenwashing and financial firms, using it for marketing purposes. Now, as you know, by way of background, we were also quite frustrated with the black and white approach of a lot of these rating agencies and methodologies. And that's when we came across you. And we think it's a perfect solution for reconciling some of these really big problems. And the beauty of it is you've come at it from the perspective of an advisor with clients' best interests. And look, I could wax lyrical all day. I just think it works. But what I wanted you to do was just give us a quick demo on how you can take a client's values, for instance, and then you can start matching that up in the transparent way that you do with an actual fund and actually give them a picture rather than trying to cram people into this sort of one size fits all paradigm. Is that a fair approximation of what you're trying to do?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the fundamental issue I always had with different data providers was lack of transparency and lack of nuance, lack of personalization. So they became the three real tenets of what we try and do here is say, what is the nuance of this client's ethical view and worldview, and how do we personalize the approach to them, but then also prove what we've done is actually in line with them and not just say it is behind an opaque wall. So what I've put together for you here is a little assessment of you, JR. Now, this is no reflection on you whatsoever. I randomly selected the areas, but effectively, if I was working with you as a client, I could take you through our little questionnaire where we could choose what's important to you, and then within those areas, rank them, and then from there, work through and say, disaster effectiveness is less important to me than climate change is more not as important to me as, say, LGBTQ, maybe I don't care about equal pay and opportunity, maybe it's less important. Whatever it is to that client, we're not judging them, we're understanding their values. And I think if you have that conversation, every client becomes an ethical investment client from that perspective, because everyone has their own views and values. And what that ultimately populates is then within that portfolio, and JR, in this case, this is the Better World 4, it personalizes the rating. So the standard rating in the case of Better World 4, I think it's about a 91 as a base, but based off what we've come out with here of what's important to your avatar in this case, it's increased that to a 93.2. So it's saying it's more irrelevant to you. And then in which areas? So the things we're not as matched up in are things like technological innovation, arts and culture, but we're really on point when it comes to life on Earth, terrestrial biodiversity, equal pay, sustainable resource use, those sorts of things. And we can then look at those against the SDGs for more of a global view to sort of validate that. And then I think the meaningfulness comes back to what are we trying to do with that? Now, as depressing as this one is, the global warming potential is still 2.39 degrees. I think we have a lot of work to go in that regard globally, but also those real world metrics of what is actually happening as a result of the money. In this case, it's the Vanguard Diversified Growth Index against your portfolio at $500,000. And it can enable you to quantify, I suppose, those areas on an individual basis, but also like how we do that. You can click on the tuna fish. I think this is that sort of the important thing about the nuance and the transparency, and understand why there's the rating. How do we get to that point? And it's not just a random number; it actually makes sense. And that plays right through different areas, such as screens, which the InvestSense has really, really strict process on screens. Any controversies and that risk to shareholder capital from that big G governance perspective, right down to carbon footprint, a carbon footprint of 6.6 million tons versus the 41 million tons on the index. I think that this sort of transparency and nuance allows you to have a better conversation with the client, and then also match match those needs up and say, well, maybe an area we're not working out so well in is, technological innovation. So let's use the research we have here to find something that does really well there to add into that portfolio.
And I think that's going to become more and more important as platforms get better at helping you do substitutions. There's more for a role for an advisor there. But even in the first instance, I think sometimes, knowing is almost enough. When people can calibrate, maybe it's not perfect, maybe it's not exactly me, but if I can see the ways in which it is me, then maybe I feel like I'm making the difference enough, if you like.
Absolutely. I find for most clients that I work with, understanding what they're invested in and progress over perfection, I think is really, really key. And that's why I'm finding that almost every client, if not every client, has some form of ethical tilt in some capacity because they care about something in this list.
And it puts for me, it puts the judgment about that back towards the user rather than saying, well, I've just gone shopping for a rating provider that makes my product look good. It's in the hands of the user, which I think is really getting to the heart of the problems that people have with this so-called greenwashing problem. So look, I think it's a great step forward.
I think as well with the SMA perspective, InvestSense doesn't hold the banks, but let's say you've got an SMA that does and a client that doesn't want to. Well, you can use the tool like this to scope those out and then remove them from the SMA and have that rebalance properly from a client's perspective. So, I think the power with using an SMA for personalization is also there as well.
And I guess when you compare the before and after, you're also able to see what kind of an impact on your own portfolio making those changes. And maybe they're not worth it. Maybe they don't really move the dial, but maybe there's other changes you could make that do move the dial. Yeah,
absolutely.
No, look, that's great. That's a really clear outline. I think we're going to be doing more of these things where we'll dig into a little bit more detail. But thanks for making the time and keep up the good work.
No worries. Thanks, JR.